Let's kick off the program with what is sure to be an innovative and engaging keynote that Barb alluded to by Brian Portnoy. He's a CFA charter holder, CEO of Shaping Wealth, an author, podcaster. Brian has written The Geometry of Wealth and How I Invest My Money. And Brian has created a bespoke presentation that should be thought-provoking, Humanizing Retirement, Behavioral Finance 2.0, AI, and the Future of Engagement. So please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you, Cheryl. The mic okay? Good. Well, I am currently healthy and unharmed, but a little nervous now. So in 35 minutes, you'll have to let me know how it goes. So I want to talk about this idea of humanizing retirement. First thing is we always like to give our content away. So QR code is here, and if you can't see it from the wings, to scan it, feel free to find me afterwards. Happy to send you a copy of this. So, humanizing retirement, what am I getting at here today? This was sort of the question that was posed for me by Cheryl a couple or 3 months ago, which was pleasantly vague and inviting, and created an opportunity to think kind of big. How can behavioral finance principles enhance retirement planning? Behavioral finance, which is maybe a fancy term for the psychology of money, it's been in place in retirement planning for quite some time. I'm guessing mostly everybody here in the room is familiar with the Save More Tomorrow program, which was invented by the top behavioral finance experts, Shlomo Ben-Artzi, Richard Thaler, people like that, that focused on sort of plan structure and investment decision making. And what I want to do today is actually create a much broader vista. And hopefully it will stimulate some forms of conversation throughout the day, because we're not just going to talk about behavioral finance. We're going to talk about the intersection of human behavior and financial guidance, and all of the opportunities that we have at that intersection for personal growth, for collective growth, and yes, for happiness and contentment. I want to pivot our North Star to start off the day with this idea of funded contentment. This is an idea that I coined in a book that I wrote some years ago called The Geometry of Wealth. And funded contentment is the ability to underwrite a meaningful life, however you choose to define that and however you update that through life's ups and downs. And by embracing this idea of funded contentment, I think when we begin to think about retirement planning, we can sort of broaden the lens and include a lot more interventions with our clients, our employees, our colleagues that will produce better life outcomes. So with this idea of funded contentment, we pivot from rich to wealthy. Rich is the quest for more, but as Don Draper said in Mad Men, happiness is that feeling right before you want more happiness. The search for more is something that once you get more, you just want more. Wealthy here is funded contentment, and we pivot the narrative in our lives from a question of more, a number, to enough, which is more of a narrative or a story. So how do we think about funded contentment and achieving funded contentment in retirement? How do we get there? So my thesis today, I think, is pretty straightforward, even though it's going to be a bit of a boil the ocean, whistle-stop tour of the human mind and money and AI. The idea here is that we want to embrace and engage. We want to embrace a much broader idea of what it means to be a human being than behavioral finance has traditionally directed us toward, which is basically narrowly focused just on judgment and decision making, and you'll see a much broader framework in a few slides. And then once we really understand what makes people tick, who they are, well, how do we meet them? Where do we meet them? We live in this attention economy where everybody is distracted. We have infinite information, we have countless distractions, and we all live in slightly different realities at this point. A quick sort of, history tour, what's taken place over the last couple generations. And I, my company's Shaping Wealth. It's a learning and engagement platform that works with wealth managers all over the world. And there's been generally a 50-year arc from more of a transactional business to a relational business. I call it the 50-year arc from Gordon Gekko to Brene Brown. It was greed is good, more is better, and now it's about meaning, it's about purpose. And what we've seen over the last generation or so is an industry, and I think it's just not in wealth management, but I think it's with employers as well, where it's just not about picking the right product or purchasing the right product. It's just not about building the right portfolio. It's having a bona fide financial plan, and it's also engaging in a deeper conversation about what's meaningful. So this is the arc that I think all of us are on. A statistic just to bring things home, the percentage of financial advice clients who say they feel unsatisfied in terms of having someone to talk to about money. So this is just a survey of financial advice clients, not the general public. So people who already probably have a fair number of assets. How many of them feel that they do not have someone to talk to about money? Anyone want to guess? 55? 70? You knew where I was headed. Two-thirds. Two-thirds of the respondents to this large N study basically said, even though I work with an advisor, I have no one to talk to about money. And when I present this to advisors, they get a little bit annoyed. They're like, well, I talk to my clients about money all the time. Like, number one, it's not my survey. Don't get upset with me. And number two, well, what might they want to be talking about that you're not currently talking about? Well, here we get into the brain, here we get into emotions, and then ultimately to money. One of my favorite lines from applied neuroscience from a book some, I think 10 or 20 years ago, says that we are not thinking creatures who feel, we are feeling creatures who think. Emotions come first, thoughts come second. And when we can lean into that idea, we recognize that money is an emotional lightning rod. Fear, greed, joy, hope, anger, envy, regret, you name it. It is all wrapped up with money because it is so tied to our survival instinct and thoughts about how we might thrive, if at all. So the way behavioral finance over the years has generally dealt with this idea of money as an emotional lightning rod. Is the mic still on? Yes, it seems like it went out for a second. The way that we have as an industry talked about behavioral finance has been a conversation about biases and heuristics. And so this is a beautiful, impossible to read infographic that lists 189 different biases. And one of my co-founders, Dr. Joy Leary, he's practicing psychologist, PhD in psychology, does this for a living, basically says it is impossible to learn these biases, to know all of these quirks of the human mind, let alone, quote unquote, fix somebody. But the way the financial services industry has embraced the psychology of money has mostly been to lean into the idea that we have these biases and we need to overcome them. And I'm here to say that when we use the word bias, it's hard not to be negative. And what we, I think, need to do is to stop pathologizing normal human behavior in the way that we make decisions, in the way that we see the world. My favorite line of all time from in behavioral finance is from the gentleman who Americanized Kahneman and Tversky, Dick Thaler. People aren't dumb. The world is hard. People aren't dumb. The world is hard. We are currently processing more information, dealing with more choice, more data than at any point before in recorded human history. And it's not at all clear that the human brain was wired to process this much information. It's why we individually and collectively feel like we're on tilt half of the time. Okay, so we are processing a lot. And so how is it that we meet people where they are? So, one of the big projects that we work on at Shaping Wealth, and we work on with wealth advisors, employee benefits companies, some other financial services, is thinking about a broader sense of the psychology of money, a much broader perspective on behavioral finance. So we go from 1.0 to 2.0. So as you'll see on the next slide or two, we're going to go beyond just that moment of choosing. Yes, we want to make better decisions. Of course we do. Whether it be in your 401k plan or at the grocery store or with a spouse or the city that you choose to live in. We always, of course, want to be making better decisions, but that's not the entirety of our mindset as we head toward what I referred to earlier as funded contentment. And so, like I mentioned, we want to stop pathologizing normal human behavior and stop focusing so much on biases. And so here we can create more of a multidisciplinary framework, channeling emotional intelligence, positive psychology, which is the science of happiness, invented by Marty Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1990s. And channeling Marty, this is a story about flourishing. Funded contentment is sort of my spin on some of the original work that was done in the positive psychology space. And so when we think about financial services, making better decisions, buying better products, building better portfolios, those are very analytic exercises, but modern behavioral finance is as much about engaging our right brain and emotional intelligence and empathy as it is analytic. And secondly, it recognizes that the neuroscience of narrative, the neuroscience of story, is very, very compelling, that we as humans are not particularly numerate. If I gave you, if I said 2 + 2, what's the answer? Okay. I thought that was going to go better. For those of you who got 4, you actually didn't calculate it. You know, if I said what's 17 + 14, what would you say? Your brain moves slightly slower, right? Because it wasn't at the tip of your tongue. What's 643 + 912? Okay, now it ground to a halt. You'll figure it out, right? But we are not a numerate species. We are a narrative species. We live our life through story. The brain is a decoder ring of a complex reality. And when we in financial services, and in particular behavioral finance, think of ourselves as storytellers more than calculators, we can have a much broader remit in helping people achieve funded contentment. So at Shaping Wealth, we've built sort of a model of the human condition to help us think about what goes beyond just judgment and decision making. And a famous line from, I think George Box lived in the 50s or 60s, but I could be wrong. All models are wrong, but some are useful. I'm going to present a basic framework that I think is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. And like all models, it's an approximation of a complex reality, right? So this is a framework that we can begin to use to think about our employees, our clients, our family members, or anybody else, okay? And so navigating our humanity. There's 6 parts to this, okay? 6 parts to this. The 4th step, not the first step, is judgment and decision making. When we think about the history of behavioral finance, Kahneman and Tversky, 2 Israeli psychologists who in the 1960s began to think about this topic, looked at the American economics profession, and basically said, those guys don't know what the hell they're actually talking about. They have no idea of what makes people really tick. And it was Dick Thaler who brought then Kahneman and Tversky to the US. But this was the anchor to behavioral finance, judgment and decision making. But there's other elements that come before it and come after it. Cognition, perception, emotion, then decision, then habit, then well-being. And the usefulness of this model is allowing us to think about employees, clients, and others in a much broader way where we can come up with interventions, both digital and analog, to help them along the way. Cognition, the machine is on. The brain is the most amazing, magical thing that we have, that we know of in the universe. It's wildly, we think markets are complex. The brain is multitudes more complex. And so we start off with not just the neuroscience of it all, but identity, value, beliefs. Who are you? Before you get to any sort of decision node, who are you, who were you, who are you becoming? Perception, okay, the brain's on, but now it's taking in all of this information. And, how much information is it taking in through our 5 senses, through interoception? There's a lot of really interesting research now into somatic experiences. So brain's on, taking on a lot of information, and then we feel something about that. Like I said earlier, we are feeling creatures who think before we are thinking creatures who feel. So we are going to feel some sort of emotions, and some of the most fascinating, powerful modern neuroscience sees emotions as a source of information. Lisa Feldman Barrett is by far the most interesting person in this space. If you want to read one book, other than The Geometry of Wealth, about all of this, you should read 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa. It is just a fantastic book, and it's very short, and it's not technical. It's a really, really good book. All right, so we feel something about the information, but then we feel compelled to act. We got to choose the mutual fund. We got to choose the life cycle product. We have to choose the, one type of jam versus another at the grocery store, whatever it may be. But over time, the brain gets tired. The brain is a gas guzzler. It's about 2.5% of our body weight and 25% of our caloric spend. It's a total gas guzzler. So the brain is always trying to economize. And so we often want to turn decisions into non-decisions, sometimes known as habits. And a lot of the modern behavioral, or legacy of behavioral finance interventions in retirement planning and 401k plans, Save More Tomorrow, it's really about nudging people such that they no longer have to decide. We'll get to that in a moment. And then ultimately, this is about us being happy, and not in the day-to-day dopamine sense, but in a deeper sense of life having a broader purpose and meaning. So this is the framework that I want to present. So when I say embrace and engage, we want to embrace a broader idea of what makes us tick and how we meet people where they are. And so behavioral science, not just behavioral finance, but behavioral science gives us so many insights and interventions at each of those stages, from who we are, what we perceive, what we feel, what we decide, what we habituate, and ultimately how happy we are. Let's talk about retirement for a second. This is, and Cheryl alluded to it, and I can't wait to hear so many of the speakers and panels today. It's a moving target. We know the history of retirement, this notion going back over the last century or century and a half, and it seems like it's in flux right now. But there's no doubt that as you're entering the back third or back fourth of your life and you're thinking about the end of your career and the transition to something different, something new, it is disruptive to who you are in multiple senses. Financially, obviously, you're going to go from a saver to a spender, and that's a habit that can be hard to break. There is a well-documented loss of identity when we stop working, right? And so you do see upticks in levels of sadness and depression, especially among men in the research that's been done when they leave the workplace, because it is such a strong part of their identity. Our time is spent different, and our social networks are altered considerably. One of the biggest transitions that we make in our investment life, in some ways, there's only two phases to our investment life: accumulation and decumulation. And almost all of financial theory, almost all of investment theory, and I spent the first 15, 18 years of my career on the investment portfolio, hedge fund side of all of this, it's all about accumulation. But in retirement, we have a very different problem, and it's just not a mathematics problem, right? It's an identity problem. It's a narrative problem. We shift our identity from someone who has accumulated to someone who is no longer doing that, and it's a really big deal. So I want to touch very quickly on 3 insights and interventions that fall out of this broader framework. Identity in the future self, turning decisions into non-decisions, and a couple words on happiness. I left the other blanks there because there's just an endless research agenda, there's an endless policy agenda that we can begin to think about when we embrace this broader sense of our humanity. So let's talk about identity in the future self. There was a really fascinating study that was done, I think it was published in 2003, 2004 by some prominent social psychologists. And the piece was called The End of History Illusion. And they surveyed in one way or another 19,000 people. And they basically asked the following question. Over the years, how have your values, preferences, and identity changed? And they took it in 10-year chunks. So I'm 55. I'm still healthy, I think, until I fall off the stage and hurt my wrist. I'm 55. I think back, okay, 45. Have I changed? Yeah, I think I've changed a little bit. I know that guy, but I changed. 35? Yeah, I think I've changed a fair bit, Tracy and I raised our kids. We've moved a couple times. Career changes, just different life circumstances. 25? I don't even know that dude. Like, who was that? Looking forward, how will you change from who you've been and are now? That's a lot harder. Our brains are effectively huge, sloppy hard drives, and our imagination is a tiny thumb drive. Our imaginations are less powerful than our memories. And so the way that these 19,000 people responded is pretty powerful. Looking backwards, I have changed a lot. Looking forward, I won't change much from here, and this is the end of history illusion. Because our imaginations of our future self aren't particularly powerful, you know, as Popeye said, I am who I am. Okay? And this leads to some really fascinating things. Hal Hirschfield, who I know has done some work with Ebri and Milken, fantastic professor of business and psychology and behavioral finance at UCLA, on the advisory board of Shaping Wealth. He's pioneered a lot of the work on future self. He published a book last year called Your Future Self, which is definitely a worthwhile read. And in one of his pieces, he writes, when the future self is viewed in vivid and realistic terms, when it is seen positively, people are more willing to make choices today that may benefit them at some point in the years to come. Okay, so a lot of the work that Hal has done is on, it's actually on imaging. So I'm going to subject my business partner, Neil, who's British, to this. And you know, this is him now, and this is him in 30 years. He told me that he is turning into his mother, which is a different conversation. Those who see age-progressed images of themselves and those who have a positive relationship, conversation with that future self tend to save more, eat more healthy, do a number of things that connect you to who that person is versus when you don't. And so, you know, we're in this really big life transition. I'm not going to walk through this, but there are psychological models of change that show us during these identity shifts, like at retirement, when we move from accumulator to decumulator, from worker to retiree, we grapple with who we are, and it's hard. It's psychologically hard. It can be a happy time, it could be a sad time, it could be a mix. And then we experiment with new identities, and we go from the long goodbye to the old self, the messy middle of churning through it, and then the new beginning. Here's who I am. And so this conversation with the future self in the context of employment, wealth management, and other spaces allows for a very rich dialogue. And it's not about decisions per se, it's about, it connects later to the contentment that we might feel. So I'll mention later some tools, both digital and analog. The second insight and intervention is along the lines of the Save More Tomorrow program. I'm guessing a lot of people here are familiar with that. I'm hoping to hear some more comments from others in terms of how they're using it. But this is a wide-scale program. It's affected, I think, going on 20 million employees. And it basically is auto-enrollment, auto-escalation, and other choice architecture and nudge technologies like that that allow us to overcome some of our wiring, some of our disposition. The vast, vast majority, 99.2% of human history, we lived in an immediate return environment. It was the here and now. It was safety. It was food. It's only in relatively recent past in the scale of our humanity that we live in a delayed return environment. And so we're still wired for the old days. So saving for retirement is not a natural thing. But there's now lots of interventions that turn decisions into habits, and it's really productive. The third of three I just want to mention quickly is that I think it's increasingly legitimate in retirement planning to talk not just about our portfolio and whether the life cycle 2050 plan is the right thing for you, but to actually ask, well, what's going to make me happy in the future? In the final quarter of life, what is going to bring me joy? What is going to bring me contentment? The way I think about it, and there's lots of models of happiness, is that we have four deep sources of contentment, what I call the 4 C's. Our sense of belonging, our sense of autonomy, our sense of being really good at something. It's where we find our flow, those moments where time disappears and you're just focused on something deeply important to you. And then what I call context, or the idea that something, you're attached to something much bigger than yourself. It could be faith, it could be your hometown pride, your patriotism, and any number of things fit in there. So a lot to say about these deep sources of contentment, but one that I'll stress here, and probably first among equals, is the fact that we are born as deeply tribal creatures. We're born very social. The Good Life here by Bob Waldringer, who carried on the Harvard study of folks over the course of a century, basically enormous amounts of data, lots and lots of narrative and anecdotes, and the bottom line is that what really drives happiness is relationships. And we can begin to think about, in the context of retirement planning for clients or employees, sort of how do we maintain those friendships and connectivity to our communities in ways that underwrite our happiness. Another quick model of happiness that seems really simple, but it's quite profound. Happiness equals reality minus expectations. All right, so when things work out better than you hoped for, you're happy at least for a moment. And when it doesn't, you're sad for at least a moment. So happiness equals reality minus expectations is a very powerful frame for thinking about how do we serve clients and employees better. And here's 18 different areas in which we're setting expectations for the future that are all pertinent to retirement readiness. So what I've tried to do here is paint a really big picture, really boil the ocean on the human condition and say that when we're trying to help retirees achieve whatever it is they want, making better decisions is really important, but there's a much broader perspective. But then we need to get to them. And we live in what my friend Kyla Scanlon calls the attention economy. She describes it as monetized distraction. I love that phrase. We live in an era of infinite information, endless distraction, countless realities. My wife and I were out to dinner with two other couples 2 weeks ago, and for better or for worse, talking politics. We live on the north side of Chicago, so you can guess the general, tone of the conversation. And we actually talked about where everyone was getting our news sources, and all 6 of us had a different kind of information matrix. We kind of were seeing some of the same things, but we're reading different blogs, listening to different podcasts, watching different TV stations, you name it. So we're all living in slightly different realities, and this can really impair our ability to focus and make better decisions. So it's one thing to understand what makes us tick. It's another to get to people where they are. So, how do we kind of humanize advice, humanize retirement readiness and planning at scale? Well, we need, again, basic models. All models are wrong, but some are useful. The way we think about it is, well, we want to figure out who somebody is or a group of people are. We want to break them into, relevant clusters, segment them, engage them with content in the broadest sense, read, write, watch, listen, you name it. We want to measure the impact of that content on, sort of how they see the world and how they make decisions and how they feel about themselves. And then we pivot, right? And so one of the things that we've done at Shaping Wealth is that we've built an engagement engine. It's for the wealth management space, but it's, we've got a pretty broad product roadmap for it. And, we have this AI called Lydia. And for what it's worth, the very first coin ever discovered was in what's now central Turkey, what was then about 2,700 years ago, the Empire of Lydia. So the very first coin ever discovered was the Lydian coin. So Lydia is sort of named after sort of the human experience of money. And she is designed to have ongoing empathic conversations with advisors and their clients on all of the things that I talked about, just not making better decisions, but future self, on identity, on information consumption, and things like that. Interface, and I'm just going to scroll through this for the sake of time, but basically a little demo here that either an advisor or an employee or a regular person can sit down and have a conversation with about, hey, what's going to be really important in identity, in retirement, identity, purpose, and time affluence comes up in some of the ways that we prompt Lydia. It's just not a prompt now, it's voice, so you could be walking around talking to her. It's pretty unbelievable, the richness of the conversations that you can have, and not just about your 401k plan, but about retirement readiness generally. On top of that, meeting people where they are. We like games, gamified engagement. So, we've thought about, lots of firms have thought about, well, instead of giving someone a boring survey or questionnaire or asking them to write something up, how about a 45-second or a 90-second game that allows them to discover something about themselves? And again, when we think about humanization at scale, humanizing retirement, these are some of the powerful ways that we are able to meet people where they are. How does AI impact retirement planning? The list is pretty endless. One of the interesting things to do is you could just ask Claude or ChatGPT, how does AI impact retirement readiness? You get a pretty robust list. What stands out to me are a few things. First of all, we can begin to think in all of this context about the hyper-personalization of retirement plans. Okay, so specifics to how someone saves, how someone spends, what their income levels are at. Those plans can be adjusted. We can also engage in really robust and rich scenario planning. So I'm thinking about moving. I'm thinking about, well, maybe there's going to be a recession in the future. I'm thinking about any number of things. How might that impact the way I construct and execute my retirement plan? And it allows us to supercharge our engagement with our future self. It's relatively easy to take some of those future self tools that I made reference to and digitize them in an AI context so that you can basically always be having a conversation with you 20 years forward about what's important. A little bit creepy, a little bit powerful, but it's here, it's imaginable. If I can think of it, it couldn't be that cutting edge. But this is what's afoot. AI for financial wellness coaching, having deeper, better conversations. Lydia does that masterfully. So a financial advisor or somebody else can kind of just sit down and have just a robust dialogue about something that's important to them, make suggestions, and just be empathic. Today, I do a whole nother talk on AI and empathy and whether AIs can be empathetic. The answer is, I think, yes and no. It's a little complicated. I think it's more yes than no. At least that's my point of view. But so anybody here using AI in their system can dig in that way. And then the last thing I'd note is that if we know that probably the deepest source of happiness in our lives is our connection to others, our sense of belonging, we can imagine that AI is going to be, I think, powerful in sort of generating new forms of community, looking across systems, within and across companies, within and across different settings, and saying, oh, okay, you've got a lot in common with these people. Here's a way to engage. All right? I think the sky's really the limit. So this was the question that was posed to me. How can behavioral finance principles enhance retirement planning? The answer was embrace and engage. I think what we want to do now, given the energy around this, is to have a much broader sense of what makes us tick beyond just decision making, beyond just save more tomorrow, to tackle things like identity and happiness and purpose, and then come up with effective engagement techniques that meet people not only where they are, but really who they are. There's another line from social psychology that I love that says that human beings are works in progress who mistakenly think they're finished. We're all works in progress. We're all figuring this out. We know the nature of retirement is changing because life is changing, the world's changing, technology's changing. Everything is changing, and embracing that can be very scary, which leads me to my very last point, which is that artificial intelligence does not mean do it yourself. Okay, so I showed some technologies. I know there's a panel right after me that's going to be digging into this. I can't wait to hear what they have to share. But the fact that everybody can effectively have access now to ChatGPT, to Copilot, to things like that, doesn't mean that, well, it's now on you to figure all of this out. And so I'm actually very bullish on the opportunity to create communities of helpers, advisors, coaches, and so forth that can help people not only make the right decisions, but before they even get there, be asking the right questions. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their attention, and I really appreciate IBRI and Milken Institute inviting me to be here today. So thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, sure, anything. Yeah. Oh, is there a mic?
So I liked your idea of bringing in happiness as one of the kind of constructs around which you think about retirement planning. And I was just wondering if it just seems like happiness is this kind of a larger, more abstract concept, as opposed to something more near term, say, for example, something like how do we get people to visualize maybe what their everyday looks like after retirement, right? And not to say that these two are necessarily mutually exclusive, but how does one kind of integrate the more kind of short-term, everyday aspects of it with this kind of broader, more abstract happiness concept?
Yeah, so you sort of answered your own question. I'm just going to amplify it in terms of, they're not mutually exclusive. And if you think about the little framework I presented with cognition and identity at one end, and then your brain gets a lot of information that it's going to decide things about, and happiness at the other end. Yes, happiness is an abstraction. It's not something that we quantify, but we have an enormous amount of not only philosophy and theology, but we have empirical research on the things that really drive the different forms of happiness that humans feel. And I would just distinguish, there's two types of happiness in the scientific literature. There's something called experienced happiness, which is day to day. You wake up, you're in a good mood, you're in a bad mood. Reflective happiness is those 4 C's, those 4 sources of contentment: connection, control, competence, and context. If not necessarily measurable, we know that they're real and we know that they're impactful. The front end of your process or question is, well, you're dealing with your day-to-day, and who are you, what's your identity, what's important to you. We're always sorting out those values and beliefs and identity, and that can be a distinct exercise. I mean, the future stuff is interesting. We're not going to go around every day having a conversation with someone 20 years forward, but we can use those insights into our values and belief to then ask a broader set of questions. So you've sort of articulated almost like a 2-step process. Think about things on a day-to-day in terms of those granular values and beliefs, and that's going to connect to a broader sense of happiness. Good?
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.